Hello. All right, so this is the second half of chapter called Things with Wings, 1934. And it started with Grandma sending Joey and Mary Alice up to the attic because the church is having a rummage sale. They're still knee deep in the Depression. People do not have much. A lot of people have nothing at all. And it looked like Effie Wilcox, the bank foreclosed her house. She lost her house, and so she had to move over to live with her sister. So the church is having a rummage sale. Grandma sends Joey and Mary Alice up to the attic to find a couple things. They had two things that they're bringing. A stovepipe hat, one of those tall black ones like Abraham Lincoln wore, and an old quilt that she's found. So we're headed to the rummage sale. The sale was in the church basement. The air was battered by funeral parlor fans. That's just hand fans that you blow like this. And ladies were picking over long tables. Some were still bringing in their treasures and trash. Others were snatching things up and taking them to the cashier's card table to pay for them. A sharp scent of potato salad hung in the air, but the ladies' circle had cleared away lunch. Now they were bringing out pitchers of free lemonade. Everybody looked up when Grandma loomed into the room, as people always did. Several pulled back, but a tall, strict-looking lady came forth. "Why, goodness, it's Mrs. Dowdell," she said. Grandma made short work of her by handing over the grocery bag and nodding at the quilt, which I offered up. Mary Alice went to look for the merchandise. At the merchandise. But the tables were surrounded by flying elbows, so I settled next to Grandma. She was on a folding chair, pouring herself a glass of lemonade. She had a way of sitting with her feet apart and her hands on her knees. After a good long swig of lemonade, she observed the scene. In fact, she was biding her time. Somehow I knew this. You know what biding her time means? She's clearly waiting for something. She's got something planned, but she's waiting before she does it. That's what biding your time means. A flurry began at the other end of a table. From their hats, they were all town ladies, not country. A hiss of whispers whipped up into raised voices. Grandma sat on, at her ease. Then the strict lady in charge, who was Mrs. Earl T. Askew, came through the crowds heading for us. Mrs. Askew's face had gone vampire white. Bending to Grandma, she spoke in low, urgent tones. "Mrs. Dowdell, I feel I must tell you that Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach, the banker's wife, has offered $15 for that stovepipe hat." Now, of course, that doesn't sound like a lot, but let's see, they gave the prices of some things earlier on. It's like lunch was like 15 cents or something. So $15 is a lot. Nowadays, $15 would be, a little much for lunch, but fancy lunch. She stared at Grandma for a reaction and got nothing back. "Mrs. Dowdell, are you 100% sure you want to part with that hat?" "Don't belong to me." Grandma made a small gesture. "I have an idea it was in with some other old stuff Effie Wilcox threw away when the bank run her out of town." Mrs. Askew's gaze was electric. "Other old stuff?" She seemed to have trouble breathing. Grandma nodded. "Just old clutter Effie had found in the house back when she moved in." Mrs. Askew pivoted like a dancer and was gone. Already, Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach was over at the cashier, peeling off $5 bills as fast as she could dig them out of her pocketbook. "Oh, Grandma," I thought, "what have you done?" Mrs. Askew plunged back. Aunt Josie Small's quilt was clutched in her arms like a long-lost child. "Mrs. Dowdell," she said. "Oh, Mrs. Dowdell, are you 100% sure?" Grandma took the quilt onto her lap, smoothed it out, and looked it over. A crowd gathered. There, in the corner, worked in faded thread, initials had magically appeared on the fraying hem. M.T.L. Suddenly, Mrs. Weidenbach appeared, gripping the preacher's stovepipe hat. She went right for Mrs. Askew. "What have you got there? Let me." "Not so fast, Wilhelmina," Mrs. Askew snapped. "I saw it first." She swept up the quilt that Grandma gladly surrendered. "What are those initials?" Mrs. Weidenbach was beside herself. "Oh, my stars and garters! M.T.L. Mary Todd Lincoln. And I've got Abe Lincoln's own stovepipe hat. His name's lettered in on the sweatband." Two things happened the next morning. A car from out of town backfired in the vicinity of the bank, and everybody on the sidewalk dropped down and grabbed gravel. Who knew but what John Dillinger was alive and well and up to his old tricks? That might need some explaining. Have you ever heard a car backfire? Basically, when a car backfires, I don't know that they really do it that much anymore, but old cars, the older types of engines would. It makes a really loud bang. It's like, and like one time I was in a car that backfired, and I honestly thought the back half of the car had fallen off of the car. So, yeah, two things happened the next morning. One is that a car backfired. Everybody thought John Dillinger was out shooting people. The other thing was a knock at Grandma's front door right after breakfast. Mary Alice and I followed when she went to answer it, opening to a stringy young guy in a seersucker suit. Seersucker is like the light blue and white striped, and it's kind of bumpy. It's just a type of fabric. "Well, Otis," she said. "What?" "Ma'am," he said, "Mr. Weidenbach would be pleased if you could spare him a moment of your time at your earliest convenience." Grandma stepped back and clutched her throat, showing shock. "Don't tell me the bank's failed. Banks is failing all over. Had I better draw out my funds? Is there time?" "No, ma'am, the bank's still in business." Otis looked down at his boots. "Your $17 is safe." "You give me a turn," she said, slapping at her bosom and shutting the door in his face. She waited an hour and a half. Then she put on her gardening hat and went uptown to the bank. Mary Alice and I went with her. When we got to the business block, people were still just getting up off the sidewalk from the car backfiring. The bank was store-sized, and the only teller was Otis, back in his cage. Back then, they didn't have security systems like we do now, so the bank tellers would be almost in like a little cage so that people couldn't rob the bank as easily. He waved us through to the rear office beside the safe. I had never seen Mr. Weidenbach before, but this couldn't have been one of his better days. Over his head, on the wall above the desk, was a wide-mouthed bass, stuffed. "You will have to excuse me," he boomed, showing us chairs. "This crack-brained rumor that Dillinger is still alive is doing our business no good." "If it's a rumor at all," said Grandma, on her dignity and then some, A rumor is sometimes truth on the trail. I am interested to hear you say so, Mrs. Dowdell. The banker pulled the purse strings of his mouth taut. It brings us to the point. Get right to it, Grandma said. Certain items, supposedly from the estate of President and Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, have surfaced in a house the bank is forced to foreclose on. Do you grasp what this could mean, Mrs. Dowdell? Grandma thought she did. So she has a plan here. It has something to do with Effie Wilcox's house. Remember, she said she got the hat and quilt from Effie Wilcox's old junk thrown out. Grandma thought she did. I expect the state will take that land and restore the house as a museum. I hear a rumor Lincoln debated Douglas in that very parlor. Frederick Douglass. Rumor has it he split the rails for the fence that used to enclose the brickyard. And who's been circulating such cockeyed rumors? The banker turned a deeper color. Who knows where a rumor starts, Grandma mused. Who knows where it'll end? They've very likely heard it at the State House in Springfield by now. I have an idea they'll send over a historian any day now to snoop. Mrs. Dowdell, the bank has signed papers with Deere and Company to build an implement shed across that entire property and the site of the old brickyard, too. Any delay throws a monkey wrench in the deal. Better times are on the way, and what's good for a bank is good for the community. Usually what's good for a bank is good for a banker. But a nice state park wouldn't be bad either, Grandma pondered. We could all set out on summer evenings, recalling Honest Abe. That park we got now is just wasteland the Wabash Railroad didn't want. Mr. Weidenbach's gaping mouth hung near his blotter now. That's the thing on your desk. He had his desktop in a death grip. Mrs. Dowdell, you falsified those so-called Lincoln items. They're bogus. I could have the law on you. That's right. Grandma gazed above him at the wide-mouthed bass. The banker throws the poor old widder in the pokey. That'll look real good for your business. Mr. Weidenbach was smaller now, deflated. Mrs. Dowdell, he said in a voice strangled with emotion, help me out of this. I'm in too deep with John Deere. I got to go forward because I can't do otherwise. Lop off your back end, Grandma said. I beg your pardon? Build a shorter implement shed over the old brickyard and leave Effie Wilcox's house be. A glimmer of hope showed in the banker's hard eye. I suppose we could go back to the drawing board and reallocate our square footage. Do that, said Grandma. And one more thing. You give Effie Wilcox back her house free and clear. It isn't worth nothing anyway, apart from its historical value. Mrs. Dowdell, that's not business, the banker said. That's blackmail. What's the difference? Grandma said. A silence was observed. Then Banker Weidenbach turned up his hands. All right. It's Mrs. Wilcox's house free and clear. But you'll have to confess you falsified those so-called Lincoln items. Fair's fair. Oh, well. Grandma sketched a casual pattern in the air with one hand. We can get that rumor going right now. Effie didn't mean to put Lincoln's name in the stovepipe hat. She just lettered in A. Lincoln to mean it was the kind of hat he wore. Mary Alice and I exchanged a look across Grandma. And that MTL on the quilt? Pshaw, Grandma said. Effie Wilcox had a cousin named Maud Teeter Lingenbloom. That's MTL for you. Mr. Weidenbach replied in an exhausted voice, I'll get the word out. Grandma was on her feet now. She patted the bun of her hair back under the nibbled brim of her hat. Free and clear, you got that? She said to Mr. Weidenbach. Effie don't make no more payments on that house. Then, as if a sudden thought struck her, she nudged me. And you can give this boy here a $2 bill. She nudged Mary Alice. And fair's fair. Give this girl $2 too. That's big money for young'uns, the banker said. Shall I draw it out of your account, Mrs. Dowdell? No, you double-dealing, four-flushing old cootie, she replied. You can draw it out of your own wallet. Any man with a wife who will pay $15 for an old preacher's moth-eaten stovepipe hat has $4 to spare. Silent wars seemed to wage in Mr. Weidenbach's brain. Then he pulled his wallet out of his hip pocket. He kept a bootlace tied around it. We watched as he drew out a pair of $2 bills and handed them to Mary Alice and me. And heaven help us, we took them. Rumors are things with wings, too. The rumor that I had $2 reached Ray Veach before I could. He was going to have to give me my driving lessons at the end of the day when he was sure his dad was out on the farm milking. Otherwise, his dad would take a cut. Also, we needed to use the Terraplane 8, which was strictly forbidden under an agreement with the Hudson Motor Car Company. I started off to Ray's that evening with a $2 bill in my jeans and a song in my heart. I felt like I was 6 feet tall and shaved. My right hand played through the gear shift positions, and I was ready. Then Grandma called out after me that she and Mary Alice were going along for the ride. And how could I explain to Grandma that learning to drive was kind of a sacred thing and you don't want your kid sister and your grandma along? Grandma filled most of the back seat of the Terraplane. Mary Alice sat beside her with an unspent $2 bill in her pocketbook. From Grandma, Mary Alice was learning thrift. That means saving your money. She could squeeze 2 cents till they begged for mercy, let alone $2. Ray was up front with me, and I was behind the wheel. I'd crept out of town in second gear, and now Ray was showing me third. I knew if I got so much as a scratch on the fender, I was a dead man, so that kept me alert. And I stayed to the crown of the road, hoping not to meet anything oncoming. Visors flipped down to keep the setting sun out of our eyes. It was a car with every refinement. And though I wasn't steering straight yet, I was beginning to get the feel of the thing. The Terraplane and I were becoming as one. I no longer let the motor die at crossroads. After we made it across the plank bridge over Salt Creek, Ray reached down and turned the radio to WGN. Out of static came the sweet strains of cocktail hour music from the Empire Room of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, Illinois. It was a modern miracle. Here we were skimming along a country road out past Cowgill's dairy farm, and we were hearing music being played in the Chicago Loop. Grandma's head appeared between Ray's and mine. "What in the Sam Hill is that noise?" she said. Ray indicated the radio. "Shut it off," she said. "Let's listen to the country." So we did. Since a terraplane is another thing with wings, I edged up to 25 miles an hour, watching the needle rise. Over the purr of the motor, we heard a wind pump squeaking as it turned, and a calf bawling, and the katydids starting up in a grove of walnut trees. I see us yet, chasing the setting sun down the ribbon of road between the bean rows in the terraplane. I thought it was about as fine a car as they'd ever make. I'm not so sure it wasn't. Grandma came to the depot with us on the day we were going home. But she wasn't there to see us off. She was there to meet Mrs. Effie Wilcox, who was coming home to her house. The Wabash Bluebird didn't exactly stop at Grandma's town. It only hesitated. As we were struggling to climb on, Mrs. Wilcox was struggling to get off. Her valise, suitcase, was full to bursting, and her eyes were everywhere. So I don't know if she spotted Grandma at first. But then somehow Mary Alice and I and our suitcase were on board, and Mrs. Wilcox was on the platform, and the Bluebird was pulling out. Grandma didn't wave. Mrs. Wilcox was telling her something. But we waved anyway.